The summer of 1940 was the zenith of Nazi Germany. France lay prostrate, her army shattered in a mere 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force, fleeing the beaches of Dunkirk, had left the bulk of its equipment as rusting trophies on the French coast. For Adolf Hitler, standing before the Eiffel Tower in a photograph that would shock the world, the war in the West seemed all but won. The only nation that remained defiant, an island fortress led by the indomitable Winston Churchill, was, in the Führer's view, a stubborn but doomed holdout. The planned invasion of Britain, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, was the logical next step, the final act that would crush the last European power standing against the Thousand-Year Reich. But in our timeline, it was an operation Hitler never truly believed in, and one he hesitated to commit to fully. For our scenario to unfold, for the swastika to be aimed across the Atlantic, we must first witness the fatal pivot, the abandonment of Sea Lion. In our history, the Battle of Britain was the crucial prelude. The German Luftwaffe, under Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, sought to achieve air superiority over the Royal Air Force as a prerequisite for any cross-channel invasion. The Spitfires and Hurricanes of RAF Fighter Command, directed by a nascent radar network and the unwavering resolve of pilots from across the Empire and occupied Europe, fought them to a standstill. The shift in Luftwaffe strategy from attacking airfields and radar stations to the terror bombing of London, the Blitz, is often cited as a critical error, giving the RAF time to recover. But the root cause was deeper. Hitler's heart was never in the invasion of Britain. He saw the British Empire as a potential partner, a fellow Aryan power that should logically make peace with him to confront the true existential threat he perceived in the Soviet Union. The fight against Britain was, to him, a tragic family quarrel. Now, imagine a different Führer bunker in July 1940. The intelligence reports are the same. The Kriegsmarine is a shadow of its former imperial self, a surface fleet ill-suited for amphibious assault. The Royal Navy still commands the waves. The Luftwaffe is locked in a brutal, costly stalemate over the English Channel. But in this timeline, a different calculation is made. Hitler, frustrated by the stalemate and enraged by Churchill's refusal to capitulate, does not merely postpone Sea Lion out of strategic ambiguity or a desire to turn east. He actively cancels it. He declares it a strategic dead end. In a conference with his high command, he lays out a new, terrifying logic. Why break our fists against this island fortress, he might argue, when the true architect of British defiance is not in London, but in Washington? This is the core of the pivot. Even in 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was conducting a dangerous, undeclared war against the Axis. The Destroyers for Bases deal, the Lend-Lease Act taking shape in the corridors of power, the blatant favoritism shown to British convoys by the U.S. Navy. All of this was seen for Berlin not as neutral acts, but as acts of war. The industrial might of America was already flowing across the Atlantic, a lifeline that made British continued resistance possible. In our timeline, Hitler chose to ignore this provocation, fearing American entry into the war. But in this one, he decides to confront it head-on. The cancellation of Sea Lion is not a retreat. It is a reorientation of the entire German war machine. The resources once allocated for the cross-channel invasion, the barges, the specialized landing craft, the air support, are now redirected. The Luftwaffe is pulled back from its attritional battle over Britain. Its losses are stemmed, its veteran pilots preserved. The focus of German industry subtly shifts. The Battle of the Atlantic, once a campaign of U-boat wolf packs against British shipping, is now elevated to the primary theater of operations. But its objective is transformed. It is no longer just about starving Britain. It is about clearing a path to the New World. Admiral Erich Raeder, commander of the Kriegsmarine, who had always advocated for a naval and global strategy against Britain, now finds his star in the ascendant. His plans for a massive expansion of the U-boat fleet, once competing with the Army and Air Force for steel and workers, are now given top priority. Ambitious, almost fantastical concepts for long-range maritime strike aircraft, and even preliminary designs for aircraft carriers are dusted off and injected with frantic urgency. The goal is to project power across the ocean, to take the war to the enemy who dares to fuel Germany's foes from the safety of their continent. This pivot creates a bizarre and chilling new status quo in Europe. Britain, relieved of the immediate threat of invasion but subjected to a continuing, if reduced, aerial bombardment, becomes a besieged but stable front. It is an unsinkable aircraft carrier, yes, but one that watches in horror as the storm it was bracing for moves west. The German army, the mighty Wehrmacht, is not entirely idle. Large forces are maintained in France to deter any British adventures. But the main focus of planning, the intellectual energy of the High Command, shifts from the chalk cliffs of Dover to the coastline of North America. The decision to abandon the invasion of Britain is, therefore, the first and most critical domino to fall. It is a decision born of strategic frustration, a twisted logic that identifies America not as a sleeping giant to be left undisturbed, but as the primary obstacle to total victory. It is a gamble of staggering proportions, betting the entire fate of the Third Reich on the ability to strike a knockout blow against a nation with 10 times its industrial potential. It ignores the vast, logistical impossibility of a transatlantic invasion, trusting in technological wonder weapons and tactical audacity to bridge the gap. By turning away from the English Channel, Hitler unleashes his war machine on a new, global trajectory, setting the stage for a conflict so vast and so terrible that the world of 1940 could scarcely have imagined it. The fatal pivot is made. The Atlantic, once a barrier, is now a target. With Operation Sea Lion officially relegated to the archives of abandoned military history, the full, terrifying industrial and intellectual might of the Third Reich pivoted to a single, seemingly impossible task: bridging the Atlantic. The Kriegsmarine's headquarters on the Baltic coast became the nerve center for the most audacious naval strategy ever conceived. Admiral Erich Raeder, no longer a voice in the wilderness, now commanded a budget and a political mandate that dwarfed those of his army and air force rivals. The challenge was Herculean. Germany possessed no forward bases, no friendly ports from which to stage an assault on the American continent. The Atlantic Ocean was not merely a body of water. It was a 3,000-mile wide moat, patrolled by the increasingly hostile, if still officially neutral, United States Navy. The project to cross it, dubbed the Atlantiküberquerung, Atlantic Crossing, became an all-consuming national endeavor. The first and most critical pillar of this strategy was the total reorganization of the U-boat arm. Under Karl Donitz, the U-boat fleet was expanded from a force of hunters into a multifaceted instrument of power projection. The existing Type 7 U-boats, the workhorses of the North Atlantic, were now dedicated to the first layer of the gauntlet, strangling Allied shipping and, crucially, establishing a forward picket line to monitor and report on U.S. Navy movements. But they were just the beginning. Shipyards in Hamburg, Bremen, and Kiel worked around the clock, their skies illuminated by the arc welders of 1,000 workers, to produce the new, monstrous Type 14 Milchkuh, milk cow, supply U-boats, and the long-range Type IXD-2 cruisers. These vessels were the lifeline. The milk cows, operating from secret, pre-positioned points in the mid-Atlantic, would refuel and rearm the attack boats, allowing wolf packs to operate for months at a time off the American coast without returning to bases in occupied France. This transformed the U-boats from raiders into a persistent, standing naval force in the Western Hemisphere. Simultaneously, the Luftwaffe underwent its own metamorphosis. The Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor, a converted civilian airliner used for maritime reconnaissance, was now produced as a dedicated weapon. But its range, while impressive for European theater, was insufficient. The focus shifted to the development of true strategic assets. The Messerschmitt Me 264, dubbed the Amerikabomber, was rushed from the drawing board to prototype. This four-engine aircraft was designed with one explicit purpose: to conduct reconnaissance and limited bombing runs from the Azores, which Germany pressured a reluctant Franco's Spain to grant access to, or even from the Norwegian coast, using Iceland as a stepping stone. The concept was not to level cities with these aircraft. Their bomb loads were too small, but to shatter the American sense of invulnerability, to force the U.S. to divert its own air defense resources to protect its coastline, and to provide critical long-range targeting data for the U-boats. The most secret and ambitious aspect of the Atlantic Gauntlet, however, lay in the realm of technological fantasy made real. At the Piedmont Army Research Center, alongside the early work on the A-4 rocket, which would become the V-2, Wernher von Braun's team was tasked with a parallel, urgent project, a rocket-assisted, long-range glide bomb capable of being launched from a U-boat. The idea was to create a weapon that could strike coastal cities like New York or Boston without risking a single German soldier. U-boats were modified with special launch canisters, and while the accuracy was abysmal and the payload symbolic, the psychological impact of a weapon of terror striking the American mainland was calculated to be immense. Furthermore, concepts for prefabricated, mobile forward bases were drafted. These Sea Adler, Sea Eagle, bases were essentially floating dry docks and supply depots, designed to be towed by U-boats or surface raiders to remote, uninhabited islands in the Caribbean or the North Atlantic, extending the Reich's logistical claw ever closer to the New World. This immense effort did not go unnoticed. British intelligence, through its Ultra program, began to piece together a terrifying mosaic. The sheer volume of signals traffic related to long-range U-boat operations, the mysterious references to Project Osterei, Easter egg, the code name for the submarine-launched rocket, and the identification of the massive new hangars being built in Norway and France for the Me-264 program, all pointed to a strategic shift of monumental proportions. Churchill received these reports with mounting dread. The warnings were passed to Washington, but they were met with a mixture of skepticism and hubris. The U.S. Navy, confident in the protective breadth of the ocean, viewed the idea of a direct German assault as science fiction. The arsenal of democracy was gearing up for war, but it was a war it still believed would be fought on foreign shores. By mid-1941, the Atlantic Gauntlet was a tangible, if not yet fully realized, threat. The happy time for U-boats had evolved. It was no longer just about tonnage sunk in the North Atlantic. Now, U-boat commanders, refueled by their milk cows, were appearing with alarming frequency off the coast of Florida, the Gulf of Mexico, and even the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. American coastal cities, still lit up at night, provided perfect silhouettes for merchant ship targets. Sinkings began to occur within sight of beachgoers. The war was no longer a distant headline. It was a fiery glow on the horizon. The Atlantic was being transformed from a barrier into a German-controlled battle space, a gauntlet that the Third Reich was systematically, ruthlessly, and ingeniously constructing. The ocean itself was becoming the front line. The dawn of Operation Eastern Tempest did not arrive with a thunderous naval bombardment of New York or a massed amphibious landing on the beaches of Florida. It began in the silent, cold depths of the North Atlantic, several hundred miles off the coast of Newfoundland, with the flicker of a single radio transmitter. The signal, encoded with the code word Donnerkiel, activated a network of forces that had been stealthily positioning themselves for weeks. The Atlantic Gauntlet had been laid, and now it would be sprung. The objective of Eastern Tempest was not the conquest of the United States, a logistical impossibility for even the most delusional in the German high command. Its goal was strategic paralysis, to shatter the American will to fight by demonstrating the utter vulnerability of their homeland, cripple their industrial mobilization, and provoke a political crisis that would force Roosevelt to sue for peace before the nation's awesome war potential could be fully unleashed. The first blow fell from the sky, but not in the way anyone had anticipated. Before sunrise, a specially modified Type IXD-2 U-boat, U-518, surfaced in the pre-dawn gloom off the coast of Long Island. Its deck contained not torpedoes, but a single, massive launch canister. Inside was a primitive, rocket-assisted glide bomb, a technological bastard child of the V-1 and the desperation of this alternate timeline. With a roar of flame and a cloud of acrid smoke, the weapon was launched. Its guidance was crude, its flight path erratic. It did not strike a military target. It overshot Manhattan and detonated with a deafening crump in a vacant lot in Queens, shattering windows for a mile around and sending a fireball into the sky that was visible from Wall Street. The damage was minimal, but the psychological impact was cataclysmic. Within minutes, radio broadcasts were hysterical. Newspapers rushed out emergency editions with headlines screaming, "German rocket hits New York." The unthinkable had happened. The sanctity of the American mainland had been violated. As panic began to ripple outward from New York, the second, more substantial phase of Eastern Tempest commenced. This was the Kleinkrieg, or Little War, a coordinated offensive by a dozen U-boats positioned from Cape Cod to the Carolinas. Their orders were simple: create chaos. They did not hunt in wolf packs. They operated as lone assassins, striking with impunity in the brightly lit shipping lanes. A tanker was torpedoed and set ablaze within sight of the boardwalk in Atlantic City. Freighters were sunk at the mouth of the Delaware Bay, blocking the approach to Philadelphia's vital shipyards. Off the coast of Florida, a U-boat brazenly shelled an oil refinery with its deck gun, the flames lighting up the night sky for days. The U.S. Coast Guard and Navy, trained for fleet actions and anti-submarine warfare in the open ocean, were completely overwhelmed by this inshore guerrilla war. Sonar was useless in the shallow, noisy coastal waters. The U-boat commanders, veterans of the happy time, found the hunting even easier than off the coast of Britain. Simultaneously, the long-range air component made its presence felt. Two of the newly operational Messerschmitt Me-264 Amerikabombers, having taken off from a forward base in the Azores refueled by a clandestine tanker U-boat, appeared off the coast of New England. Flying at an altitude that put them just beyond the reach of the few P-40 Warhawks scrambled to intercept them, they conducted a high-speed photo reconnaissance run over the naval installations at Newport, Rhode Island, and the industrial works of Boston. One of the aircraft, in a bold act of psychological warfare, jettisoned its small bomb load not on a factory, but into the waters of Boston Harbor, a symbolic gesture meant to show they could have destroyed the city if they wished. Their contrails etched high in the sky were a silent, terrifying advertisement of German reach. The American public's reaction was a volatile compound of shock, fury, and profound fear. The press and political opponents of Roosevelt, led by isolationist figures like Charles Lindbergh, seized upon the attacks. "I told you so," became the mantra. They argued that Roosevelt's provocative actions had brought this war to American shores. Why were American boys going to die to settle a European quarrel when the enemy was already here, bombing our cities and sinking our ships? Demands for an immediate ceasefire and a negotiated peace with Germany echoed in the halls of Congress. The political unity that Roosevelt would need to wage a global war was shattered before it could even form. Militarily, the response was frantic and disjointed. The entire eastern seaboard was placed on a war footing it was utterly unprepared for. A mandatory blackout was imposed from Maine to Miami, crippling coastal commerce and nightlife. The Army Air Forces, its best squadrons and commanders earmarked for Europe or the Pacific, found itself forced into a desperate, ad hoc coastal defense role. Untrained pilots and obsolete aircraft patrolled endless miles of coastline, seeing phantom periscopes in every wave. The Navy was forced to pull its capital ships and precious aircraft carriers back from patrols in the central Atlantic to protect the homeland, effectively ceding the sea lanes to the U-boats and breaking the lifeline to Britain. Operation Eastern Tempest achieved in days what years of conventional warfare might not have. It turned the United States inward. The sleeping giant was not awakening with a unified roar of vengeance. It was stirring from its slumber confused, panicked, and stabbed by 1,000 small, bleeding wounds. The Atlantic was no longer a moat. It was a highway for a relentless, invisible enemy. The assault on the American coast had not won the war for Germany, but it had successfully plunged its most formidable future opponent into a state of strategic paralysis and political disarray, buying the Third Reich the one thing it needed most: time. The shockwaves from the rocket impact in Queens and the burning tankers off the coast did not remain confined to the shoreline. They radiated inward, traveling along railroad tracks and telephone wires, vibrating through the very foundations of American society. The United States of late 1941 was a nation psychologically and materially unequipped for war on its own territory. It was a country that had built its identity on the twin pillars of geographic isolation and boundless optimism. Operation Eastern Tempest shattered the first and severely tested the second. The home front was now, literally, the front line, and the ensuing chaos revealed a nation struggling to reconcile its self-image with a terrifying new reality. The most immediate and visible change was the imposition of the coastal blackout. From the fishing villages of Maine to the resort hotels of Miami Beach, an order went out. Not a single chink of light was to be visible from the sea after sundown. The brilliantly lit boardwalks of Coney Island and Atlantic City, symbols of American leisure, were plunged into an eerie darkness. Street lights were extinguished, and citizens were ordered to hang heavy blackout curtains. Car headlights were fitted with slotted covers, reducing traffic to a slow, cautious crawl. This was not the organized, resolute blackout of London. It was a frantic, patchwork effort. In wealthy neighborhoods, compliance was swift. In tenements and poor rural areas, where black fabric was a luxury, people used paint, cardboard, or blankets. The darkness bred more than just inconvenience. It bred fear. Every distant sound, a backfiring car, the rumble of a train, could be the precursor to another attack. The blackout did more than hide the cities from U-boats. It cast a pall of anxiety over the entire eastern seaboard. This pervasive fear found its most destructive expression in the eruption of public hysteria and suspicion. The term fifth column became a national obsession. With German U-boats operating with seeming impunity just offshore, the public became convinced they were being guided by saboteurs on land. Any light glimpsed through a blackout curtain could trigger a mob of angry neighbors accusing the occupants of signaling to the enemy. German Americans, once largely integrated communities, now found themselves viewed with open hostility. Businesses with German names had their windows smashed. Innocent citizens with accents were reported to the FBI, overwhelming its field offices with thousands of baseless tips. The most infamous incident occurred in Long Island, where a local farmer was nearly lynched by a vigilante group for using a flashlight to fix his tractor after dark. They were convinced he was communicating with a U-boat. The social fabric, woven with threads of trust and community, began to fray under the strain of paranoia. The economic disruption was swift and severe. The Kleinkrieg offensive against coastal shipping achieved its strategic goal with devastating efficiency. Maritime insurance rates for the eastern seaboard skyrocketed, making commercial shipping prohibitively expensive. The vital flow of raw materials, Texas oil, Florida phosphates, Gulf Coast sulfur, to the factories of the Northeast was strangled. Shipments were delayed for weeks, and some were canceled altogether. Factories in Detroit, already retooling for war, faced shortages of components normally shipped via the coastal route. The nascent assembly lines for tanks and aircraft sputtered and stalled. The government's response was a hastily imposed system of rationing and priority allocation, but the bureaucracy was not yet in place to manage it effectively. The result was shortages of everything from gasoline to rubber, not due to a lack of material, but due to a catastrophic breakdown in its distribution. The arsenal of democracy was finding its supply lines cut before it could even fully arm itself. Politically, the nation was plunged into its most severe crisis since the Civil War. The isolationist America First Committee, once a vocal minority, saw its membership swell. Its message, now delivered by a triumphant Charles Lindbergh, resonated with a terrified populace. "We warned you that Roosevelt's war would come home to us, and now it has." How many more queens must be bombed before we end this madness? Impeachment proceedings against the president were openly discussed in Congress. Roosevelt, the master politician, found himself cornered. His fireside chats, once a source of comfort, now sounded defensive. He was forced to divert military resources he had earmarked for Lend-Lease to Britain and the Soviet Union to the defense of American cities. The grand strategy of building a coalition to defeat the Axis was collapsing under the weight of a direct, localized threat. The national unity that would famously emerge after Pearl Harbor in our timeline was nowhere to be found. In its place was a bitter, acrimonious debate over national survival. The American home front in the wake of Eastern Tempest was a portrait of a nation unprepared. The technological and military shock of the attacks was profound, but the psychological and political shock was catastrophic. The belief in continental safety, a cornerstone of American identity, was gone, replaced by a visceral vulnerability. The nation was not marching to war. It was reeling from an assault it never believed possible, its industrial might hamstrung, its people fearful and divided, and its leadership under siege. The German strategy of strategic paralysis was working. The sleeping giant was awake, but it was disoriented, punching wildly at shadows in the dark, its immense power dissipated by fear and internal strife. The paralysis induced by Operation Eastern Tempest was deep, but it was not permanent. It was shattered by a single, transformative event, the public execution of a U-boat crew. After U-206 sank a passenger liner turned troop transport, the SS Coastal Venture, off the coast of Virginia, it lingered to survey the carnage. A swarm of hastily deployed U.S. Navy destroyers and Coast Guard cutters, driven by a feverish rage, depth-charged the submarine into a forced surrender. The surviving crew of 42 were paraded in front of newsreel cameras, their uniforms tattered, their faces etched with fear. That evening, in movie theaters across the nation, Americans saw the faces of the men who had been terrorizing their shores. The public's terror did not vanish. It crystallized into a cold, unified fury. The debate was over. The America First Committee was drowned out by a national roar for vengeance. The sleeping giant was not just awake. It was incensed, its industrial heart beginning to beat with a new, terrible rhythm. The first and most decisive front in America's retribution was the factory floor. The very attacks meant to cripple American industry became the catalyst for its ultimate mobilization. President Roosevelt, his political position secured by the public's shift in mood, went on the offensive. In a historic address to a joint session of Congress, he declared, "The wolf is at the door. We will not merely shut the door. We will break its jaws." The Victory Program was launched, an industrial plan that dwarfed anything previously conceived. The temporary disruptions in coastal shipping were solved with breathtaking speed. A massive, federally funded project redirected freight onto the nation's vast railway network, while convoys of trucks, dubbed Liberty Lorries, began moving materials along newly prioritized inland highways. The skies over the East Coast, once a realm of fear, now throbbed with the constant drone of patrol aircraft rolling off production lines in numbers Germany could not comprehend. This industrial might was directed with surgical precision. The number one priority, winning the Battle of the Atlantic. Shipyard from Newport News to Portland shifted to a 24-hour work cycle, their glow visible for miles. The answer to the U-boat threat was not just more ships, but a new kind of ship, the Liberty ship. Using prefabricated sections and revolutionary welding techniques, these ungainly but vital vessels were launched in a matter of days. The phrase "a ship a day" became a national mantra, a tangible symbol of American counterpunch. Alongside them slid hundreds of new, specialized warships, destroyer escorts, subchasers, and small escort carriers, jeep carriers, designed specifically to provide air cover for convoys across the entire Atlantic span. The technological contest was also joined. American scientists, leveraging the nation's lead in electronics and computing, fast-tracked the development of improved radar sets, sonobuoys, and the Hedgehog mortar system. turning the hunters into the hunted. At sea, the U.S. Navy's strategy transformed from reactive defense to relentless, aggressive hunting. Admiral Ernest J. King, a man known for his iron will, was given a single directive: clear the Atlantic. The hunter-killer group was born. Built around a jeep carrier, these small, fast fleets did not wait for U-boats to find their convoys. They prowled the known U-boat supply lines and meeting points, identified by codebreakers and long-range patrol planes. The milk cow supply U-boats, once the linchpin of the Atlantic Gauntlet, became primary targets. Their loss was catastrophic for Donit's fleet, stranding attack U-boats thousands of miles from home with empty fuel tanks and dwindling torpedoes. The mid-Atlantic air gap was closed, first by carrier-based aircraft and then by very long-range B-24 Liberators, which could now fly from Newfoundland to the Azores. The ocean, which Germany had sought to dominate, became a killing field for the Kriegsmarine. This retribution was not confined to the sea. The political will now existed for a project that had once been deemed unthinkable: a direct, conventional strike against the source of the aggression. While a full-scale invasion of Europe remained years away, the concept of a first strike against the German foothold in the Americas gained traction. Intelligence pointed to Spain's Canary Islands and, more boldly, the Vichy French-controlled Caribbean island of Martinique as critical nodes for German resupply and espionage. The U.S. public, no longer fearing retaliation but demanding it, supported audacious action. The stage was set for Operation Sentinel, the first major American amphibious operation of the war, aimed not at liberating an ally, but at seizing forward bases to strangle the German war machine and carry the fire back to the enemy's doorstep. America's awakening was not the slow, groggy rise of legend. It was a violent, explosive reaction to a direct and personal insult. The nation's immense capacity for production, innovation, and violence, once scattered and unfocused, was now channeled into a single, unified purpose. The fear that had gripped the home front was forged into a weapon of steel and resolve. The Atlantic, which Hitler had sought to turn into a German lake, was becoming an American highway for an avenging army. The retribution had begun, and it was being built ship by ship, plane by plane, with a relentless, overwhelming power that only the United States could muster. The final collapse of the Third Reich did not come with the storming of a bombed-out Berlin by the Red Army, but with the silent, chilling broadcast of a German-language radio transmission from a U.S. Army station in occupied Iceland. It announced the unconditional surrender of all German forces in the Atlantic theater. The war, of course, would sputter on in other arenas, but the central, defining conflict, Hitler's desperate gamble to strike America first, was over. Its failure was total, and its consequences would reshape the world order for the remainder of the century and beyond. The map was not merely redrawn. It was shattered and reassembled according to a new, American-designed blueprint. The most immediate and profound outcome was the uncontested and absolute hegemony of the United States. Unlike in our timeline, where post-war power was balanced in a tense bipolar world with the Soviet Union, America, in this reality, emerged as a solitary colossus. The war had been brought to its shores, and its response had been a demonstration of industrial and military power so overwhelming that no nation would dare challenge it for decades. The Europe-first strategy of our history was replaced by an America-first strategy that had been proven on the battlefield. The United States had not entered a European war. It had fought and won an American war provoked by a European aggressor. This resulted in a profound shift in geopolitical psychology. The U.S. felt not like a liberator returning home, but like a guardian who had preemptively eliminated a threat at its source. The post-war institutions, the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, were established not as partnerships, but as instruments of a Pax Americana, with Washington as the undisputed capital of the New World. Europe lay in a state of ruin far more profound and politically bizarre than in our timeline. The Soviet Union, having been spared the devastating German invasion of Operation Barbarossa, was a vastly different power. The Red Army was immense but untested, its industry intact. Stalin watched from the sidelines as the capitalist powers bled each other white across the Atlantic. When the German regime finally collapsed under the weight of its own logistical impossibility and the relentless American strategic bombing campaign, now focused solely on Europe, a power vacuum of unprecedented scale emerged. The United States, its trust in European stability irrevocably broken, had no interest in rebuilding the old continent to its former glory. Instead of the Marshall Plan, there was the Fortress America doctrine. U.S. troops secured naval bases in Iceland, the British Isles, and the Azores, but poured minimal resources into rebuilding France, the Low Countries, or even a victorious but exhausted Britain. Europe was left as a shattered, fragmented continent, with a powerful, suspicious Soviet Union eyeing the wreckage from the east and a resurgent, militant Germany potentially simmering in the center. The Iron Curtain, when it fell, would not divide Germany. It would stretch along the Vistula River, leaving a broken Western Europe vulnerable and dependent. The fate of the British Empire was particularly tragic. Britain had won, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. It had survived the Blitz and the threat of invasion, only to become a permanent forward operating base for the United States. Its economy was shattered, its empire crumbling, but without the substantial American financial aid of the Marshall Plan to soften the blow. The special relationship was not one of partners, but of patron and client. The United Kingdom was the unsinkable aircraft carrier, its sovereignty permanently mortgaged to the nation that had, in the public's mind, single-handedly won the war. The sun set on the British Empire, not in a gradual, managed decline, but in the swift, stark realization that it was now a junior partner in an American world. Militarily and technologically, the world was frozen in a permanent state of high-alert defense. The concept of forward defense became the cornerstone of American strategy for a century. The U.S. Navy, having perfected the art of global power projection and anti-submarine warfare, became the world's policeman by default. Its fleet of supercarriers, a direct legacy of the jeep carriers that hunted the U-boats, patrolled every ocean. The terrifying experience of the rocket attack on Queens fueled a national obsession with missile defense and aerospace dominance, leading to the birth of the U.S. Space Command decades earlier than in our world. The lesson learned was not one of international cooperation, but of absolute technological supremacy and continental isolation enforced by a global ring of steel. Finally, the American national identity was permanently altered. The myth of invulnerability was replaced by the doctrine of hypervigilance. The memory of burning tankers off the coast of Florida and the crater in Queens was seared into the national consciousness, a permanent wound that justified a massive, permanent military-industrial complex. The country embraced its role as the world's sole superpower, not with reluctant responsibility, but with a grim determination born of direct experience. Isolationism was dead, but in its place was not internationalism. It was global hegemony. Hitler's desperate gamble to avoid a two-front war by striking a knockout blow against America had backfired in the most catastrophic way imaginable. He had not defeated the United States. He had forged it into an unassailable global empire, created a broken and volatile Europe, and ensured that the 20th century and the 21st would be forever known as the American century. The world was remade not in the image of a thousand-year Reich, but in the image of a nation that had been attacked, enraged, and unleashed.